Hello, so I wanted to hop on live quickly and talk about emergency funds, how to save for your emergency fund if that's a goal for you. Now, for those of you who don't know, my name is Veronia and I'm a money coach, and I really help women to save more money and also help them to start investing so they can work towards things like financial security and financial independence ultimately. So let's talk about emergency funds. Now, the reason why I wanted to go live and talk about this topic is because I just recently spoke to a client, and one of her main goals is to save up for an emergency fund. So she wants to save, I think, about 10K to just have cash sitting there just in case anything happens. So if you're maybe on the fence of even thinking about an emergency fund, it is really to have cash to basically pay for emergencies if that happens. And for me, I am probably one of the biggest advocates for emergency funds. You can call it a granny rainy day fund, whatever it is, but essentially it's having a pot of money to help you in case something happens. So what I want to do in this live is talk about why having an emergency fund is probably quite important and why you should consider it if you haven't already, but also how to actually start saving for your emergency fund so that you can get that cash quickly and have that kind of peace of mind. So for me personally, when it comes to having an emergency fund, the reason why I think it's so important is because there have been times where I did not have an emergency fund and all I had was a maxed out overdraft. And so I remember a few years ago, there was a time where my car completely broke down. I had no idea what was wrong with it. I had to call up, AA, the road coverage company, and they came, took my car to the garage and basically told me that you need to change something in the car. I don't remember what it was, but it was gonna cost me about £200 or dollars. And in my mind, I remember I was like, I don't have that money right now, even just 200, which may not seem a lot to some people. At that point, because I was living paycheck to paycheck, I did not have that money. And even when it came to my overdraft, I originally had about £2,000 in my overdraft, but that was completely maxed out. And so for me, I then ended up having to call my mum, asking her if she could send me money. She didn't have time, so she couldn't do it. I then had to ask my partner at the time, who wasn't even my husband. He was actually my boyfriend at the time. I actually had to ask him for money because I did not have anything. And I remember feeling so bad because I was like, had he not sent me that money, I had no idea what I was going to do. Essentially, I would have had to just leave the car in the garage because I just didn't have the money at all. And I think when I started thinking about emergency funds, I realized had I had an emergency fund, I would not be in that position. I would not be sweating trying to figure out how I'm going to pay for my car, because I would already have money sitting in my bank account. And I think sometimes we don't realize how emergency funds aren't just there to just, have cash sitting there for emergencies, but sometimes it's just having the peace of mind knowing that you can pay for something in case something happens. So had I known that, I've got cash sitting there, I wouldn't have worried. Sitting in the garage, I wouldn't have had to call up my family or call up my partner trying to ask them for money. All I would have done is just gone into my account and paid for it. So when it comes to having an emergency fund, I think it's just really important to first think about how it's actually going to help you. Do you want peace of mind knowing that if something happens to your car, or if something happens to your income, do you want that peace of mind knowing that you'll be able to tide yourself over at least for a good few months, or you'll be able to pay just in case something happens to your car or something else breaks down? So that's one of the first things you want to be thinking about when it comes to your emergency fund. So let's now talk about how to actually start saving for that emergency fund, what to do, maybe how much you should have in your emergency fund, because I know that's typically a question that people always have. And I will always say that it's all going to depend on your personal circumstances. It's all going to depend on your type of income. It's going to depend on whether it's for you yourself. So are you a single person, or do you have, multiple incomes coming into the household? There's so many different things that you want to think about. But one of the things that I would say is, when it comes to your emergency fund, think about, okay, how much would I ideally like in my emergency fund, and how much do my expenses come to, so that I know that I could tide myself over for a few months. So for example, let's say that your expenses come to $2,000 a month. So you typically spend about 2,000 a month. You'll then want to think, okay, well, how long would I want to tide myself over if something happened to my income? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 9 months? Is it 12 months? Because I think sometimes one of the things we also forget to think about is, yes, when experts say, you know, ideally you want 3 to 6 months worth of expenses, that's all well and good, but you also have to think about what you're comfortable with. If I tell you that you should only have a 3 months worth of expenses as your emergency fund, and you're sitting here sweating telling me that's not enough, well then for you it's going to make sense for you to increase that, and maybe you would be more comfortable with 6 months or 12 months. So you want to think about what are you actually comfortable with? How much would you personally want as your emergency fund? The other thing you want to think about is, again, as I mentioned, your household. So is it just you? Are you the sole responsible? Do you have sole responsibility for all of your bills, or is it yourself and the partner? So are you kind of split? Are you likely to both lose your jobs at the same time? Maybe not. So for example, in my case, because I'm married, I know it's unlikely that both of us would be unemployed at the same time. I know most likely at least one of us would still be employed, so that will have an impact on how much we choose to have in our emergency fund. So there are different circumstances that you want to think about, but it's really starting to just think about a number so that you can now start creating a plan to help you start saving for it. So if, for example, you know that, okay, your expenses come to $2,000 a month, and that's like your core expenses. So if anything happens to your income, you know you need to be paying $2,000 a month. If you then say to yourself, okay, I would want to tide myself over for about 3 months because it's, you know, not just me, it's me and my partner, for example, well then you'll be thinking that you ideally want to have about £6,000 or dollars as your emergency fund. So that would be a really good starting point. So once you have that number, $6,000, that's when you can start thinking, okay, how am I now going to start saving for that $6,000? So it's being quite clear on the number, and that number can change, by the way. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be so set in stone where it's like, oh no, it has to be $6,000. You might increase it. You might save up for the $6,000 and then decide, actually, I think we'd prefer $10,000 or $12,000. Honestly, it doesn't matter, but it's just having a good start, because I think one of the things we struggle with is we almost kind of get paralyzed with the number and say it's like $6,000. What tends to happen, actually no, what tends to happen is you tell yourself, oh no, I ideally want to save $12,000, but that seems like a lot, and then you just don't end up saving for it at all, and you don't even end up saving for the $6,000 because you feel like, oh gosh, $12,000 is just too much, I can't save for it. So it's really just thinking about a simple number that you can tell yourself, okay, I can save up for this. And then ask yourself, how quickly do you want to save up for that emergency fund? Do you want to save up for it over the next year? Do you want to save up for it over the next 6 months? How quickly would you rather have that cash in your account to give you peace of mind so that if anything happens, you're okay? So depending on how quickly you want to save up for that fund will then depend on how much you now start saving, maybe each month or each quarter, for that emergency fund. So for example, for that $6,000. So I would say that that's really the basis that you want to think about. It's actually having that number, how much should you have in your emergency fund, and then start thinking about your plan to start saving up for that emergency fund, depending on how long it would take you. So let's maybe talk about maybe one of the mistakes that I typically see when it comes to trying to save up for an emergency fund. One of them, actually, I'll probably talk about more mistakes, you know, more than one. One of them is, again, kind of almost not being realistic with how much you can save for that emergency fund. So then you end up getting paralyzed. So if, for example, you tell yourself, oh, I want to save up 20 grand for my emergency fund, but you're struggling to save up 1,000, well then it probably won't happen, because you'll be thinking, oh my gosh, this goal is way too much. So one of the things you want to think about is, okay, how can you even just think about doing a starter emergency fund? Why don't we start with 5K? How can you start saving for your 5K? Because when you start to achieve things, that's when you realize that things become easier, and you realize that actually it can happen. So if I use myself as an example, when I was trying to save up for my first emergency fund, and this is when I was still in debt, so I wanted to create a small emergency fund, you know, so that I wouldn't end up going back into debt even more. What I wanted to do is create a small emergency fund. I could have told myself, oh, I'm going to save up 10k. Being aware that I'd never saved money before at all. I didn't even have a savings account. So for me to try and save 10k, it just wouldn't have happened. And I literally would have said 10k is too much, and I probably wouldn't have tried to save any money at all. But what I told myself is, I'm first going to save 500, because even 1,000 for me, when I first had the goal, even 1,000 for me was a lot. I actually wanted to save 1,000, but that was a lot for me because I'd never saved money before. But I said, okay, if I can try and save 500 and just save that 500, I think I could do it. I think it was realistic. And even saving for that 500, it actually took me a while. Like it took me a good few months because I kept dipping into my savings and I kept doing loads of different things. But eventually I saved that 500. And then when I saved that 500, I was like, oh, I could actually bump that up to 1,000. And then I ended up saving 1,000. And then I had money to now also start overpaying on my debt. So I had that mini emergency fund, and then I was overpaying on my debt. And then it got to a point where I had then overpaid on my debt. It took me about 18 months to do that. I had about 16 grand, if you didn't know. But I overpaid on that debt, and then I decided to beef up my emergency fund, and I then increased that to 3,000. So I went from having a 500 mini emergency fund to saving for at least 3,000. And the reason why it was just 3,000 was because I was living at home at the time, and because actually it was COVID, so it's not like I had any I didn't really have any expenses because we were all at home, right? But it was because I started small, and when I started small and I achieved that goal, that's when things started to snowball. Okay, so what I'm just trying to say is, when it comes to saving for your emergency fund, yes, you will have the ultimate number. You might want a year's worth of expenses. You might want 6 months worth of expenses. But if that seems like a lot to you and you're already struggling to save, start small. Even just having a little bit of cash is helpful, because I realized that because I'd been so used to living paycheck to paycheck, even me just having 500 in my account was amazing, because had something else happened, I wouldn't have to I wouldn't have to go back into debt again. Like if something else happened to my car, I would have been able to pay for the 200 pound or dollar bill from the garage, right? So it's still starting small, so that you can kind of give yourself those quick wins, and you'll be surprised at how that can now start to snowball. And before you know it, you'll then be able to start saving up for your emergency fund. And then you can start doing anything else. Like you can save for other things as well. So I hope that was helpful. Yes, I've seen a couple of comments. I'm glad to hear that this was good advice for you. But I think I'm going to leave it there. If you do want any further support when it comes to saving up for your emergency fund quickly, that's exactly what we do with one-on-one coaching. I can help you figure out how much you need in your emergency fund, how to actually save for it quickly. So definitely check that out. You can book a call to find out more about one-on-one coaching. And if you have any questions, actually, let me know. Right here, if you've got any questions. I do have one question. Have you tried daily saving? I don't typically do daily saving because it's a very good question. I don't typically do daily saving because the way I save money is I pretty much plan it all in advance. So I don't really try to make like daily savings here and there. For me, I know that there's a certain amount I want to save each month, and it will happen. So what I will then do is tell myself, okay, if I want to save £1,000 this month, I know how to save £1,000 this month. Like I've got to the point where I can save money like that, so that I don't necessarily need to focus on doing it daily. Because especially for me personally, I'm naturally a spender. Like, although I know how to save, I'm naturally a spender. So for me, the way I save money is I want to know that I've saved the money from the beginning of the month, and I don't need to think about it again. So as soon as the month hits and my income hits, those savings are gone. Like it's done. It's already done. So I then don't need to think about it. And then for the rest of the month, I use that to spend whatever, how I like. I just spend the rest of the money. My husband, on the other hand, I'm pretty sure he does daily savings, because the way he just showed me his personal, we both have personal accounts basically. So we save money and then we pay our bills and then we invest, and then we can spend, you know, we have like separate spending accounts as well as like a normal spending account. But like my spending account pretty much goes down to zero by the end of the month. Like I spend money. I happily will spend the money, but I don't worry about spending that money because I know I've saved it. Whereas my husband, on the other hand, I'm pretty sure he does daily saving, because his account has just been increasing. Like I literally looked at his account, I think it was like yesterday, and I was like, how have you got so much money in your personal account? How have you, like, he's got hundreds in there. And I'm like, what have you been doing? He basically just doesn't spend his money. Like he just does, he probably does things like daily savings and just doesn't spend his money. Me, on the other hand, I spend it. But then I know how to save. So then I don't really have a problem with it personally. So I think it just kind of depends on your kind of personality. If you're a natural spender like me, sometimes I find it's just easier for you to know how to save that money, get it out of your system, and then you're done. You're free to spend it. If you're maybe more of a natural saver and you enjoy like finding ways that you can save money, then that's also an option. That's also something that you can do as well. So I hope that answers your question. But it can also be helpful when you are trying to like save up for your emergency fund as well. If there are like any other savings that you can make, of course, you can then start adding that to your emergency fund. So it doesn't need to be like really rigid. But yeah, any other questions? If not, I'm going to leave it here. I think I did mention that I will try and do more lives more often. So it will probably be around lunchtime. So if you can ever join me at lunch, join me. Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave it here. As I mentioned, if you do want more support, definitely make sure you book a call via my link in bio to find out more about one-on-one coaching. But yeah, thank you guys. And I will see you soon in another live. Bye.